Thank you all for joining us. So my name is Michael Newman. I'm the Chief Executive of the AJR, and it's very nice to see you all as ever. I'm looking through the screens, there's a lot of familiar faces, so it's very nice to see you all again. And if this is your first event, your first encounter with the AJR, then this is a chance to just tell you a little bit about us and our work, which, as you may have gathered, is to represent and support Holocaust refugees and survivors and their families, principally through the dispersal of social welfare services, which has obviously taken on a new dimension in this past year. Obviously, we're missing our interaction with our members, our in-person meetings, and we also know at the same time how much that our online activities have transformed our work during the pandemic and has enabled us to connect with newer audiences and people and members that we don't always hear from. So it's very nice to see so many of you joining here today. Also, just to ask if you know of anyone who you think could benefit from our assistance through our social welfare provision, then please do let us know. We're in a very fortunate position of being able to disperse a grant, a social welfare grant we receive from the Claims Conference, which is funded by the German government, exclusively for survivors and refugees. And we would love to hear from those people as well as to who else we can assist. The other limbs of our work are to engage with the next generations. So obviously there's a tremendous amount of the second and even the third generation with whom we're engaging, and to whom falls the responsibility to carry forward the legacy of their parents and their grandparents. And we are also a benefactor of Holocaust education and remembrance projects and programs. And that very much links us with our speakers today, because like the AJR, but on a global scale, the Claims Conference also disperses grants for memorialization projects through their RED fund, Research, Education and Documentation. And one of the successful applicants are colleagues who are with us today from the University of Oxford for a fascinating project entitled Teaching the Holocaust Through the Jewish Country House. And the country houses are powerful symbols of national identity, evoking the glamorous world of the landowning aristocracy and its feudal origins. By contrast, the country houses of the Jewish elite that were once ubiquitous in Britain and across continental Europe have largely faded from national memory. So what do the fate of these houses, the philanthropic commitments of their owners, and the extraordinary art collections that once embellished them tell us about the changing place of Jews and Jewishness in an age of political antisemitism that culminated in genocide in the aftermath of the Holocaust? And as this is such a far-reaching project, today's talk is part one of two sessions, and will focus on homes, collections and national memory. The second talk later this year will examine Jewish country houses as sites of rescue and post-war renewal. And for those of you who are already members, you would have seen in the May edition of the AJR Journal, to complement this talk, there's an excellent article. In fact, what we'll try to do is we'll put a link to the article in the chat function, so you can have a chance to read it there. And you can also use that chat function if you want to ask a question or have a comment as the talk progresses. So as we've done in the past, we're going to keep everyone on mute to save any background noise. But today's event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, the AJR YouTube channel, which has a whole range of events that we've done over this past year that you can refresh your memories for. And it will be there, and this event will be there in a couple of days' time. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce our speakers. Abigail Green, Professor of Modern History Modern European History at the University of Oxford, and Tom Stammers, Associate Professor of Modern European Cultural History at Durham University. Abigail and Tom, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Michael. So we are so pleased and so honoured to be talking to the Association of Jewish Refugees about our work today. Thanks so much to Michael Newman for this invitation, and to Susan Harrod, Deborah Barnes and Joe Briggs for coordinating things so effectively. So as Michael said, today is the first of two talks. This one today really looking at houses and collections and the issue of national memory. And the next one will be focused much more on the house's role in wartime and as centres of Jewish relief. So this initial paper emerges out of a collaborative AHRC-funded project that brings together European historians, Jewish historians, art historians, and curators. And you can see some of our collaborators here. The project focuses on a hitherto unidentified group of country houses, those built, acquired, and renovated by Jews, and takes them as the starting point for exploring the world of the Jewish aristocracy. In this slide, you can see 6 of the core National Trust properties that we work with frequently in the UK. And many of you might know some of these houses. As you'll see, they all look very different. And rather than trying to identify a common typology, we recognize in this project that Jewishness takes many different forms and is less an issue of architectural style than it is of relationships. Because while these houses today fulfill many different functions, what unites them is their common history as Jewish homes. Now, this history has been undervalued and underexplored because Jewish country houses do not fit in with our paradigms about aristocratic landowners, or indeed our paradigms about metropolitan Jews. Yet Jewish country houses could once be found all over late 19th and early 20th century Europe. Abigail, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. And I'll just briefly say, indeed, it is a real pleasure to be able to present this project to you. So some of these properties, like the National Trust ones, are now museums of international importance, attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors. Good examples would be Waddesdon and the Villa Efrosi de Rothschild, which I hope we're going to see soon. There we are. But many more, of course, have been demolished, or like many other British houses, which were country houses, they've been repurposed. So this is a good example, which we'll talk about later. Worth Park, which belonged to the Montefiore's before and after, and now an undignified set of modern flats. And others have become schools or downmarket events venues which trade on the titles and connections of their owners. And we've given 2 examples here, the Chateau de Ferrières, which belongs to the French Rothschilds, and in the back you can see James and Betty de Rothschild, portraits of them. And underneath we have Port Lympne, which is a safari park hotel in the home of Philip Sassoon in Kent. So they've had diverse fates, and some indeed have become modern ruins, lost places. These are 2 examples. I had a very haunting visit to Schloss Schenkendorf myself quite recently. But a few have acquired a kind of symbolic value. So on the Riviera, Theodor Reinach's Greek villa, which you can see here, has actually become a kind of symbol of French and European culture. It's where Emmanuel Macron took President Xi for dinner before the days of the pandemic. So it has a kind of emblematic quality. And you can see here the Magen David floor in Villa Carolus, the way in which its Jewishness is actually quite clearly present. So the varied fates of these properties, some of which are prized and many of which are not, speak to the anomalous position that their owners occupied in post-emancipation European society. In a rural landscape still powerfully structured by Christianity, Jewish country houses had a transgressive quality. Nevertheless, people who write about the history of the English aristocracy, like David Cannadine and Joe Mordaunt Crook, who've written these two books here, which are both important, tend to treat families like the Rothschilds and Montefiore's as indistinguishable from other members of that larger, de-ethnicized and more diffuse group which Cannadine describes as the plutocrats and Crook as the nouveau riche. So I think both are really quite loaded terms which replicate rather than interrogate the prejudices of the landed classes. Cannadine, for example, insists on treating the Rothschilds as if they were just like the rest of the nouveau niche, and when he does so, he overlooks the historic exclusion of groups of the Jews as a group from the rights and privileges of belonging to the British establishment, and also overlooks their role as a lightning rod for hostility towards Jews and capitalism, and as a focus for anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jewish globalism. To discuss, as he does, Queen Victoria's refusal to grant a Rothschild peerage simply in terms of new and old kinds of money seems to us to miss the elephant in the room. The British aristocracy had in fact always been open to new money. It was a famously open elite. But when it became open to new Jewish money, something fundamental shifted. Back in the mid-18th century, when foreign-born Jewish financier Samson Gideon bought this house, Belvedere, in Kent, he found that he couldn't, in fact, acquire a title as well as the house because he was a practicing Jew. Gideon's children married out, and Belvedere soon ceased to be a Jewish home. But in the 19th and 20th century, and that's what's different, many Jewish so-called plutocrats chose, in fact, to remain Jews in their marital and business networks, their philanthropic practices and international commitments. They functioned to some extent as a group apart. And we argue that the country houses of the Jewish elite embody both that change and that continued difference. The submerged, often embattled place they occupy within the heritage landscape speaks to the difficulty of incorporating Jewish families and their houses into existing narratives about Englishness, like Downton Abbey, the landed aristocracy, and Jews. Consider the fate of the Rothschild treasure house, Mentmore. Designed by Joseph Paxton, who designed the Crystal Palace as well, its collection rivaled that of the British royal family. Back in the 1970s, and some of you may remember this, its decoration, fittings, and furniture were completely intact. But in fact, it was impossible to save Mentmore for the nation, which is what this poster is enjoining us to do, because at the time, Mentmore did not seem sufficiently English. As Viscount Norwich, who was speaking on behalf of the National Trust, really, in the House of Lords, put it, he said, "It's not in any way characteristic, it's not typical, it represents the international banker's Jewish taste of the Rothschilds. But surely, my lords, it is no worse for that." His plea failed, and in 1977 the treasures of Mentmore were dispersed. Today, like similar houses in France, Germany and Italy, and here we can see two of them, Mentmore is inaccessible to the public, its future uncertain, and its fabric in disrepair. Now, each of these countries, so Britain, France, where Beauregard is, and Italy, where we can see the Villa Bischofsheim, relates to its heritage and its own Jewish past and history of anti-Semitism in a particular way, and of course Britain is no exception. Nevertheless, the fact that the Holocaust happened there, in continental Europe, and not in mainland Britain, has created a fundamental divide between the history of European properties and the history of Jewish country houses in Britain itself. So this is Strawberry Hill House in Twickenham. Strawberry Hill and the Château de Senef in Belgium, which we'll see in a minute, are both celebrated as icons of 18th century national architecture. But it's one thing to exclude the Jewish Lady Waldegrave, as she was known, and you can see her here, Countess Frances So it's one thing to exclude her and the international banking Stearns who bought the house from her from narratives about Strawberry Hill, which focus on Sir Horace Walpole, who was the inventor of the English neo-Gothic. But it's obviously something rather different to present the Château de Senef to the Belgian public, with barely a mention of its last owners, who we see here, the family of Franz Philipson, and to restore the house to its 18th century state as if, in fact, that family had never lived there, never altered the building, never planted an English garden, and never fled the coming of the Nazis, who proceeded to occupy Belgium from the comfort of their former home. So the silence about the Jewish past in both cases is similar, but the context gives it a different meaning. And yet, we have found that on both sides of the channel, heritage professionals working in country house museums find it surprisingly hard to integrate the Jewish story. So in December 2019, before the pandemic, we held a conference for 50 British heritage professionals, which addressed precisely this issue. And on this slide, you can see some of the ideas they expressed about why it was they found it hard to present the Jewish histories of their properties. And besides ignorance and lack of confidence, I think two factors really seem to be central. The lack of a specifically Jewish collection, so they're looking for Chanukiot and mezuzot, and the difficulty of fitting Jewish houses into the established stately home narrative of continuity, family, rootedness, and land. So what Tom and I are going to do is to juxtapose two British case studies which help us to think through these problems. On the one hand, the Salomons estate near Tunbridge Wells in Kent, which you can see here, and on the other hand, Upton House in Warwickshire, home of the Bearsteds, also here. Both houses belonged to that group of Anglo-Jewish families Chaim Bermant called the cousinhood, and both families actually played a prominent role in the City of London, where David Salomons became, in 1836, the first Jewish sheriff, and in 1855, the first Jewish Lord Mayor, an office that Marcus Samuel, the first Viscount Bearsted, would later occupy. But with houses in Paris and on the Riviera, the Salomons and Samuels were also cosmopolitan families with increasingly global horizons. And here you can see the Bearsteds' villa at the top at Cap Ferrat, which is actually very close to Villa Kerelos, which we saw earlier. And although neither of these families were really Zionists, both took an active interest in the social and economic development of Mandate Palestine. And Vera Salomons, in fact, founded the Museum of Islamic Art in Jerusalem. But despite these commonalities, the way Jewishness is now articulated through their country houses is radically different. Private, family narratives predominate at the Salomons estate, whereas at Upton the focus is squarely on the public display of fine art. Although just across the paddock, there are still Jewish descendants of the Bearsteds. So here is Broomhill, looking very nice. Now it's a bit lackluster, but once it was a grand Victorian mansion. The house was originally conceived on a smaller scale when the future Sir David Salomons purchased an elegant Regency villa near Tunbridge Wells in 1829, at a time when the right of Jews to own land was still uncertain and the campaign for Anglo-Jewish emancipation just getting underway. This remarkable neglected property owes its survival to his great-niece Vera, who was the last in her family. And here we can see Vera with her husband. In 1937, Vera Salomons gave Broomhill to Kent County Council, stipulating that the house should be used as a college, museum, scientific institute or convalescent home, that the word David Salomons should form part of its name, and that 2 rooms should be used exclusively as a memorial hall containing the mementos now there relating to her father, the late Sir David Lionel Salomons and his family, with additional pictures displayed elsewhere and public access to all these spaces. So by giving her childhood home to the local community, Vera ensured its survival as a family shrine, and if you ever find yourself near Tunbridge Wells, I would urge you to visit it. Responsibility for the objects and documents Vera chose as mementos was vested in the Jewish Board of Guardians, and further provisions were made to protect the Salomons' burial ground. A final clause reflecting the climate of the 1930s instructed Broomhill's new owners not to allow any instructions, speeches or entertainment of an anti-Semitic or political tendency or trend to take place or to be broadcast in any of the buildings or any part of the said property. And this obviously speaks to the climate of the time. It's something which is happening in the 1930s. So the museum has benefited from some professional curation, but the small size of the collection means that it very much does reflect the story Vera wanted to tell. She chose all the objects here. The old library, which you can see in the bottom two pictures, is dedicated to the memory of her siblings, parents and grandparents, above all her beloved brother David Reginald, who died a hero in the Great War. And next to it there's a sculpture hall which contains memorabilia related to the career of her great-uncle Sir David. Above all, this bench, which you can see, on which he forcibly tried to take his seat in the House of Commons in 1851, at a time when all elected MPs were still bound to take a Christian oath. And beyond the struggle for civil liberties, Jewishness is celebrated elsewhere in the museum and collections. Here, in a case dedicated to friends and family, and I want to draw your attention particularly to the postcard at the back of the Kotel in Jerusalem and a stone from the Kotel, because this will come up, but you might also note there's the Ten Commandments, obviously, and to the left you can see a bit of a picture of Sir Moses Montefiore. Hidden away in the cupboards of the old library, we came across an early Sephardic Siddur, a handwritten book of Jewish prayers which belonged to Vera's grandmother, and a flyer produced after the pogrom of Kishinev, proudly displayed in the same room are 18th century vestments that once adorned the private synagogue in Vera's grandfather's house at Hove. Even this portrait, which we can see here, of the three of the Salomons women, carries a Jewish subtext, so it was painted by a Jewish artist, and you can see at the bottom a detail from the frame. If you look closely, you'll see that there is a kind of Magen David relief embedded into it. But this painting, with its view of rolling hills and a church spire, it's a view of the drawing room at Broomhill, actually, reminds us, I think, that the life of the Salomons family was also inextricably entwined with the British social and cultural context in which they operated, and that Jewishness may not always have been as present in the house as it is now. Vera's father, David Lionel Salomons, was an inventor, scientist, and pioneering photographer. His experience with the medium give us a flavour of daily life at Broomhill, and here we can see some snapshots from his photograph. There are a lot of amazing early photographs at the Salomons estate. So there's nothing particularly Jewish about any of these images, and that's probably not surprising. As Leora Auslander has argued, Judaism occupied a kind of episodic place in homes like these, although even the most resolutely secular families were usually more connected to Judaism than might appear, and this was certainly true of the Salomons. David Lionel's parents had indeed been religious. As a boy, he attended a school run by Sir Moses Montefiore's secretary, Louis Lerver, who was a former tutor of the Khatams, a student of the Khatam Sofer, who was one of the leading ultra-Orthodox rabbis in Central Europe in the 19th century. And something of this training was transmitted to Vera, who could, as she said, spout the little Hebrew she knew when she first visited Jerusalem in 1925. And in this period, Vera even considered purchasing the Vakf property, which belonged to Islamic foundations, right by the Kotel, so that Jews could pray there in peace. Possibly inspired by the stone, which we saw earlier, which she had been given as a family heirloom by her father in 1917 a week before the Balfour Declaration. And here we can see the back of that postcard, which I pointed out earlier, with David Lionel's inscription, Yerushalayim. Tellingly, however, though David Lionel clearly anticipated some kind of Jewish funeral, he stipulated that the service should be in English and chose to be buried in the field behind the little chapel at Broomhill Bank, an idiosyncratic decision that underlines his rejection of established religion. So this was a man whose public identity was thoroughly bound up, in fact, in science. And when he curated a souvenir album of Broomhill in 1898, he chose not to foreground the conventional attractions of his country seat, but rather to present the house as a giant laboratory and technological showcase, the first in the country in which electric power was employed for workshops, domestic and other purposes. And you can see some of the machinery from inside the house here, and also the garages, which were, I think, the first garages in Britain and are the most highly listed part of the entire building. Now, his achievement in bringing electricity to Broomhill has now been almost completely forgotten, but it was the focus of a multi-page spread in that glossy Edwardian publication, The House Beautiful, which you can see here, called Electricity in the Home, and an article about that written by him himself. And this vision of the house as a marvel of scientific modernity maps, in fact, rather imperfectly onto the museum which Vera created, which centres not on the resplendent science theatre, which you can see here, and which still exists as a wedding venue, but on the more conventionally grand sculpture hall, which also exists and which you saw earlier. But if we look a little harder, we can see parallels between the narratives father and daughter chose to tell. Let's flick back to the beginning of David Lionel's souvenir album. So we approach the house from afar, admiring the observatory and landscaped garden, and drive up to the gate. To our left, as we enter, so here we are, we can see a billiard table, and next to it, in fact, the parliamentary bench. At one end, under a canopy, there is a bust of the first Sir David Salomons. The next couple of shots feature images of the sculpture gallery, a combination of contemporary figures and classical motifs. But again, if we look more closely, we can see further allusions to Sir David's mayoral career in the statue of Dick Whittington, once again under a canopy. Honouring the uncle who made him his heir, David Lionel chose to thread the story of his career as the first Jewish Lord Mayor through the prestige rooms at the heart of the house, in much the same way that his daughter did when she told that story through the museum she created. The country house sculpture gallery was an aristocratic genre, but here it appears with a subversive twist, presenting the Salomons' bourgeois Jewish origins in the City of London as a source not of shame, but of pride. And if we return to the museum that his daughter left, we can see that in fact it's the city, at least as much as the parliamentary story, that takes centre stage. In the portrait of Sir David, the mementos of a civic banquet he organised in honour of the King of Sardinia, and a plethora of other testimonials and invitations recalling city events. Tom, your turn.
Thank you, Abigail. And I should just say again that I'm a historian of collecting. And so in this section, we'll be thinking a little bit more about the objects that were once in these spaces. So with the Salomons, then, we have a family in which successive generations were intensely aware of the memorial function of their collections. Yet if we think a little bit about some of the objects that were taken out of Broomhill and donated elsewhere, we get a kind of fuller picture of some of the other locations that mattered to the family. So Sir David Salomons, the first Jewish Lord Mayor, viewed his picture gallery as a sort of dynastic possession. He was hugely proud of it, and he urged his heirs to preserve it as an ensemble. Sadly, today dispersed, the catalogue reveals that it contained many works on Old Testament subjects, all painted by Jewish artists, not least Solomon Hart. And Solomon Hart is interesting because he was the first Jewish member of the Royal Academy in the 19th century, and he also was a portraitist, of many leading Anglo-Jewish families, and you'll see his famous portrait here of Moses Montefiore. Sir David also gave very generously to the metropolitan institutions that he served, first being elected as an alderman, and he was elected in, if you know your city of London, he was elected in Portsoken ward there on the east of this map, and then later as Lord Mayor. And unsurprisingly, his gifts were centred on the Guildhall, the institutional heart of the City of London, including a large silver group that had been presented to him by the Jewish community in 1836 to celebrate his fight for religious liberty. Now, interestingly, David Salomons had a very interesting brother, Philip Salomons, who was a pioneering collector of Judaica in the 19th century. And Philip Salomons donated 400 volumes of Hebraica to the Guildhall Library. And he also, Sir David gave an extra £1,000 to enable similar purchases. So both of these bequests, I think, underline the centrality of Jews and Jewish culture to the City of London and to its institutions. Now, it's Philip's son, David Lionel, as we've seen, who in some ways was less involved with communal Jewish organizations, but much more interested in science and in London clubland. He was also a very committed Francophile, which was reflected in an amazing collection of French 18th century books. Indeed, one French curator at the start of the 20th century described Broomhill as the Wallace collection of the book. Now, this Francophilia was reflected in his generosity to French institutions. This includes magnificent timepieces, so fantastic 18th century clocks built by Breguet, a man whose biography David Lionel Salomons wrote, very interested in this sort of Enlightenment science, and also an amazing collection of 5,000 prints related to the history of modern transport that he left to the Bibliothèque Nationale. And in his will, he stipulates that he gave these in memory of the kindness and courtesy I've always received in that country. Now, I raise this because it's important to say that many of these French or cosmopolitan elements are no longer visible in Broomhill. And that's because Vera wanted to curate the space primarily as a memorial to the men in her family and in a way that was appropriate for the Kent context. Broomhill is therefore the very opposite of your average public museum, with the great art left in and the private stuff taken out. Rather, the fascination of Broomhill is that so much of the private life of the family is still on display. Among some of the prestigious objects that were removed, I just want to point to this collection of Breguet watches, amazing 18th century watches, some of which were made for Marie Antoinette and which Vera bequeathed to the L.A. Meyer Museum in Jerusalem that Abigail mentioned earlier, a museum that Vera helped set up to promote dialogue between Arab and Jewish cultures. So I think the diversity and also the fragmentation of the family's collections speaks volumes about their plural identities as Britons, Londoners, Europeans, and Jews. So let's turn now to our second example today, Upton House in Warwickshire, which is a rather austere country house, which was the residence of Walter Samuel, 2nd Viscount Bearsted. When the house was given to the National Trust after the Second World War, James Leese Milne was rather sniffy about the architecture, but he was dazzled by the contents. And this is a quote from his diary: "There is a lot of Chippendale-style furniture and Chelsea china of the very best quality. The picture collection superb, as fine as any private collection in England." And today it's the kind of celebrated picture collection which is still at the heart of interpretation at Upton. If you go and visit, and again, please go and visit now that things are opening up again, and you buy this little Upton House and Gardens guidebook, you'll find that it makes only a single mention of the Beersteds as Jews. It also rather inaccurately implies that the purchase of Upton in 1927 was the family's first taste of the prestige and pleasure of country living. Instead, the guidebook wants to minimize the difference between the Beersteds and their other aristocratic neighbors, and tries to sort of turn Upton into a gateway to the country house weekend of the 1930s. To give one other example, it tells you a lot about Lady Beersted's enthusiasm for the hunt. She was a great patron of the Warwickshire hunt, and there's lots of equestrian and hunting material in the house, but it omits all mention of the holiday cottage that they kept for the family rabbi. However, no less than the Salomons, who also had an amazing house in Mayfair, the Samuels were a London family. For much of the week, Lord Beersted lived at Carlton Gardens, and during the week, he worked as chairman of Shell Oil. You might know the amazing Shell building here on the embankment. Upton then was never really a cosy family home, but was rather a winter hunting box, which he used as a showcase for his art. Indeed, he had the squash court at Upton converted into a picture gallery by the architect Ernest Joseph. Now, some of you might know that he's a Jewish architect. Ernest Joseph is the man who built that Shell Mex headquarters on the embankment, but he also created this picture gallery at Upton, where Lord Beersted could show his art. So, seeking to try and think a little bit more then about the London context of the Samuel family, Robert Whaley Cohen, who is the husband of Lord Beersted's granddaughter, has chosen to write an alternative history of the Upton estate, which is where he still lives. As a grandson of Sir Robert Whaley Cohen, who was very important president of the Board of Deputies, Robert is himself a scion of the cousinhood. And what's interesting about Robert Whaley Cohen's history of Upton is that he understands what was singular and crucially what was Jewish about such families, including their pride in their role in the City of London. And if you look in some of the city churches, you can still see crests of the Beersted family and the Whaley Cohens presented together. So let me just say a little bit about where the Beersted fortune came from. In some ways, it's inseparable from the climax of the British Empire. Walter Samuel's father, Marcus Samuel, had begun to build a giant shipping firm back in the 1860s, where he profited from the opening up of Japan. And in the 1890s, he was the first man to sail petroleum through the Suez Canal, so sort of benefiting from these new transport arteries. In 1891, Marcus Samuel was elected alderman, and then in 1902, he became the third Jewish Lord Mayor of London. And he used this platform to protest against pogroms in Romania and Russia. And indeed, his daughter Nellie became the first Jew to be married in the Mansion House, which you can see on the bottom of the screen here, and is still the official residence of the London Mayor. Now, in 1895, the family acquired their first country house, and you can see it here. It's a convalescent home today. This is the Moat, which is a Regency property outside of Maidstone, which had about 500 acres, and where Marcus Samuel engaged in hunting, shooting, fishing, and cricket. And that's become important for the subsequent history of this site, because it is now, the grounds of the Moat, the home of Kent County Cricket Club, in that he bequeathed it to the local council. And he was also hugely generous to Maidstone Museum. Those of you who ever go to Maidstone Museum might know that there is a special Beersted wing where a lot of the family collections were donated, including some really sensational pieces of Japanese art, including samurai armor and Edo woodblocks that the family had acquired through their contacts in Asia, but that they bequeathed to the Maidstone Museum. So I think collections then can give us a real clue about the family's business interests, yes, but also some of their passions and their interests. And these passions, I think, are visible still in Upton, even if they're a little bit more discreet. Walter Samuel continued to keep cuttings at Upton related to his father's career at the Mansion House. And if we look closely at some of the objects on display, they still have a kind of metropolitan association. So I'm showing you this porcelain figure here in the top right. This is a figure of John Wilkes, who was a famous 18th century radical and a Lord Mayor of London. And so the more you look at these collections, the more you see that there are clues about the family's identity that you can still read. So in this last bit on collecting, let's talk a little bit about donations and think about sort of beersted cultural philanthropy. Marcus Samuel was a regular donor to the Guildhall Gallery. Again, think about the importance of the City of London. And this included some of the great Victorian paintings that you can still see today in the Guildhall, like this lovely Frederick Leighton here at the top. From his father, Walter Samuel imbibed a strong sense that the art should be cultivated not just for personal pleasure, but also for public benefit. So, like many Jewish aristocrats, the second Viscount was actively involved in communal charities. He served on the board of the Council for German Jewry, but he's also a major figure in London museums in the 1920s and 1930s. And he gives gifts both to the National Gallery, where he's a trustee. And at the top of the screen, you'll see this fine painting by Valentin de Boulogne that he gives to the National Gallery. But he also presents works to other galleries in London, some of which have much more interesting Jewish content. So on the bottom left, you'll see this beautiful painting by an Austrian painter, Isidor Kaufmann, of a rabbi the Lord Beersted gave to the Tate in the 1920s. It also should be added that along with his sister, Nellie Ionides, he was a key early donor to the London Jewish Museum, which was set up in 1932. And I'd suggest that over time, his philanthropic and his cultural activities became increasingly interconnected. So to give you one classic example of this, in 1939, at the Lord Baldwin sale at Christie's, Beersted donated a portrait, you can see it here, painted by Thomas Lawrence, in order to raise funds for Jewish refugees from Nazi Europe. And this was a cause that Lord Beersted had championed throughout the 1930s. In 1936, he went to the US and he met President Roosevelt in order to raise money and raise awareness about the plight of Jews in Europe. He was also one of the key figures in funding the Kindertransport, which was administered from Upton, and he worked with 3 other Jewish philanthropists to ensure that the cost of bringing 10,000 Jewish children to the UK would not fall on the British government. So just before I hand back to Abigail, let's give one more example where we can see how art and philanthropy fit together. This is Whitechapel Art Gallery in the Jewish East End. The gallery had been founded in 1899, and due to its location, it very quickly engaged with Jewish immigrant audiences, not least because of its large Yiddish library. From its origins, it started doing exhibitions that showcased Judaica, but also works by Anglo-Jewish painters like Mark Gertler here. Today, we tend to remember Whitechapel as a place linked to modernism. And this is a little bit of trivia for you. Whitechapel was the only gallery in the 1930s that showed Picasso's Guernica. And you can see the Guernica here being displayed in London and introduced by Clement Attlee. However, overall, the finances at Whitechapel were very shaky, and its exhibition program was actually much more mixed than that would suggest. As a result, when Lord Beersted took over, it was a fundamental event in the history of the gallery. He was able to kind of pump funds in and to stabilize it. And he's actually been remembered in some ways as the re-founder of the Whitechapel Art Gallery. Bearsted took over in 1943, just after an exhibition on artists' aid jewelry. So this was a show by refugee artists in London to help raise awareness about the plight of Jews in Europe in 1943. And you'll see this fantastic poster here on the left. And if we look at the archives in Upton, we'll see that the East End was a cause really close to Lord Bearsted's heart. He was very involved in the Stepney Jewish Lads Club, a kind of boys' organization which had been set up by his brother, Gerald Samuel, but that Walter Samuel remained very loyal to in memory of his brother, who was killed in the First World War. So as a closing example, after the war is over, Lord Bearsted allows a portion of the magnificent paintings at Upton to be exhibited in the Jewish East End. The first time this happens is in 1948, where he puts together this Old Master show, where the catalogue sort of celebrates these paintings now as part of the national heritage, because they've just been given to the National Trust. And he repeats the gesture again in 1955. And in practical terms, I should say that this Upton show was a huge success, with around 500 visitors a day. In a deprived working class community which had been recently ravaged by the Blitz, its symbolic impact, I think, is hard to exaggerate. I have one quote. Visitors to the gallery might be forgiven for thinking they'd accidentally stumbled into an outstore of the Wallace collection, one scholar has remarked. It was the archetypal country house content show, even down to the National Trust sponsorship, except that there was an appropriate Whitechapel edge to it. This edge came from the fact that these old master paintings, symbols of private wealth and connoisseurship, take on a new meaning when exhibited to a much broader, unfamiliar public. Perhaps for the first time, the piece continues, the readership of Country Life and the Illustrated London News have been brought together in the East End. So the Salomons and the Samuels we've tried to suggest were self-confident dynasties who didn't want to ape aristocratic habits. Rather, they were very proud of their connection to the City of London, as we can see in their generosity to the Guildhall. The country houses they built wanted to commemorate these achievements, but in ways that were appropriate to the rural setting. At Broomhill, Vera pruned and curated the collections to create an intimate memorial to her family. At Upton, where Lord Bearsted's descendants still flourish, the family's origins can initially seem hidden behind all of this great art. But when we look at how these objects circulated, how this art was used, and how it was kind of exhibited more broadly, we can see that these collections remain thoroughly linked to the more metropolitan and Jewish dimensions of the family's life. Abigail, a coda. Abigail, you're on mute.
I'm now going to go on and talk about the role of country houses like Broomhill and Upton as sites of Jewish memory. So while the English countryside represented only one aspect of their social lives, nowadays it is in provincial towns like Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells and on their rural estates that the memory of families like the Salomons and Bearsted seems most alive. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of this. One which is best known to me would be Sir Moses Montefiore's country house in Ramsgate. So Sir Moses Montefiore was a celebrated Anglo-Jewish philanthropist, and I hope we're going to see him in a minute. I'm still waiting for Montefiore.
Sorry.
There we are. This is his home. He's a celebrated Anglo-Jewish philanthropist who died childless, leaving the estate to his nephew, Joseph Sebag, and the picture on the left is the house as Sir Moses lived in it, and then we can see the Sebag extension and reformulation of the house in the bottom right. In fact, little remains of this house at all now, but hidden down an unremarkable footpath in Ramsgate, the Montefiore Synagogue and Mausoleum associated with this lost house survive. And there's an amazing picture here, which we found in the Salamers estate, of what this religious complex looked like when the Montefiore's lived there. Because the synagogue and the mausoleum were actually part of a broader complex focused on something called the Lady Judith Montefiore Theological College, and you can see a close-up of it in the bottom right-hand corner. And this was really a kind of rabbinical kollel with an English twist. So it was a place for 10 rabbis and their families to pray, to study, and to recall their founders' achievements and pray for the soul of Sir Moses and his wife. And I think it's striking that obviously Sir Moses could have chosen to establish a Jewish foundation in the city of London where he was born, and where in fact he followed Sir David Salomons as the second Jewish sheriff, but instead he chose to be remembered in Ramsgate. And perhaps as a result, the memory of the Montefiores is still cherished there. There's a pub, the Montefiore Arms, and the Hebrew letter Mem adorns the mayor's chain of office, which is obviously quite an unusual thing. But Ramsgate isn't actually as unusual as I've always thought it. So this is Worth Park, which you may remember from the beginning of the talk. It was home to 3 generations of the Montefiore family, and the family was actually once so intimately associated with the town of Crawley that Souvenir China featured their coat of arms with its distinctive Hebrew banner, which has the word Yerushalayim on it. And you can see some little pots here, which Elizabeth Stephen, who's a member of the Local History Society, has been buying on the internet. So descended from Sir Moses' brother Abraham and his wife Henrietta Rothschild, these Montefiores too were pillars of the Anglo-Jewish community, observant Jews and prominent Zionists. Visitors to Worth Park with its Osborne exterior and spectacular and eclectic interiors stuffed with artworks remarked its extravagance and the mezuzot fixed by every bedroom door. There's a little quote here about the little bottle of the law being screwed upon the door of every bedroom. And so this, in fact, like the Montefiores and the Salomons, was a Jewish dynasty which did not stand the test of time. The marriage between Sir Francis and his wife was short-lived, and he, in fact, died childless in 1935. 5 years earlier, however, he had gifted the village hall, which his mother had built nearby, to the local community, renaming it the Montefiore Institute. Slightly shabby, but greatly loved, it is still in use today. And in this unremarkable building, we find a kind of Jewish variant of the ancestral portrait gallery, which is such a common feature of aristocratic English country houses. So at the back, at the bottom, you can see portraits of, which we now have close-up, of Sir Francis and his parents, Joseph and Henrietta Montefiore. And in the entrance hall, there's this rather crude copy of an 18th century family portrait depicting Abraham Montefiore as a child, together with his parents and his elder brother, the future Sir Moses Montefiore. And I think this is a painting which has really an important symbolic rather than monetary value. It tells us who this family are. And it's a painting, in fact, which still hangs in many different Sebag Montefiore family homes today. It's a kind of origin myth image. As sites of memory associated with more or less forgotten houses and as charitable foundations rooted in specific localities, we've got Broomhill, we've got Three Bridges, and we've got the Montefiore estate in Ramsgate, all of them speaking to the profound connections these families forged with local communities in rural England, and to their pride in who they were, not aristocrats, but British Jews. And I think these memorials are distinctive in a British context because they don't actually follow a pattern of behaviour among non-Jewish elites. But they're also distinctive in a continental European context, where obviously Jewish dynasties like these usually met more brutal ends. And we're going to look at one example from Brandenburg in Germany. So this was the home of Walter Rathenau, who was the foreign minister of the Weimar Republic, but also an industrialist and aesthete. He was assassinated in 1922. And after he was assassinated, his sister left the house and park at Schloss Weinwalde to the local authority with the proviso that they create a memorial, quote, to the old Prussian culture of the turn of the 18th century, because it was actually a Prussian royal palace, and to Walter Rathenau. So for Rathenau, this house embodied the enlightened spirit of Janus-faced Prussia, like the good side of Prussia. It was a conscious evocation of the national past. But precisely because it was, as, and you may remember that quote earlier, as Viscount Norwich might have said, characteristic, and did not represent the international banker's taste of the Rothschilds, it was also an act of appropriation and self-assertion. So through this house, Rathenau declared his ability to understand what it meant to be Prussian more than anyone else. But in fact, he never became an insider in Bad Freienwalde. You can see some rooms from the interior in this image. And when Junker neighbours like Bettmann Hollweg, who was a leading politician, they refused to return his calls. He could call on them, but they wouldn't come back. Today, Freienwalde is in fact at risk, and you could buy it for €1 if you could come up with an appropriate business plan for a small palace in the middle of nowhere with a tragic past. But at the moment, its future looks quite grim. So on one level, I think the message of our project is simple. In order to understand properties like Freienwalde, Broomhill and Upton, we need to read them side by side. But I think the stories these houses tell is also more complicated than that. The excision of Jewish life in continental Europe through the Holocaust has created an obligation to remember at a national level, which is missing in Britain. But in local contexts, in places like Freienwalde, that sense of untroubled connection is no more. In Britain, by contrast, families like the Salomons and Montefiores remain relevant in places they once loved, even though, in the broader scheme of things, the cosmopolitan, metropolitan and multicultural twist they brought with them has vanished from view. It doesn't fit the stories we tell ourselves about the English countryside, or the stories we've begun to tell about British Jews. It's telling, I think, that class and not Jewishness figures predominantly in the stories which locals like Elizabeth Stephen tell about the Montefiores of Worth Park. But if you go to Freienwalde, it's Jewishness which is central, not class. But in fact, the intersection of class and Jewishness was central to what happened to these houses in the 20th century and the versatile functions they served. Whether in Britain or Germany, their owners were the only Jews to possess great landed estates, to travel, live and marry internationally, to play key roles in modern banking and finance, and to move in elite political and social worlds. This was a truly Jewish aristocracy, and crucially, these families also formed the backbone of the modern structure of Jewish diplomatic and philanthropic networks and institutions. Take the Warburgs, who, like the Samuels, combined business with artistic interests. So they were a German Jewish banking family which established branches in Britain and the United States, where they built the Joint Distribution Committee, which was a Jewish institution. You may have heard of it. It survives to this day, the JDC. And during and after the First World War, the JDC sent hundreds of millions of dollars to Jews in Eastern Europe and Palestine who were caught in the crossfire of war and revolution at the beginning of what our colleague Jacqueline thinks of as the long Holocaust. It was a humanitarian effort second only to that of the US government. In Britain, meanwhile, the Rothschilds of Waddesdon Manor became committed Zionists who were instrumental in obtaining the Balfour Declaration and provided money for Jewish land acquisition and medical services in Mandate Palestine, and later helped to fund the core democratic infrastructure of the State of Israel. This is a picture of the Knesset, which was funded by the Rothschild Foundation. The country houses of both families testify to these histories of Jewish philanthropic activism. After 1945, the Hamburg Warburgs recovered their family villa at Blankenese, which you can see it here, and gave it over to young Jewish Holocaust survivors. Before this, the Rothschilds of Waddesdon had helped to underwrite the Kindertransport and housed several dozen Kinder on their estate who were known as the Cedar Boys and Girls. As the home of the Rothschild Foundation, Waddesdon remains an engine of international Jewish philanthropy, even today. And that is the later story of these houses as sites for Jewish relief and renewal that we hope to examine next time, when we will look more at the role of Jewish country houses and estates during and after the Second World War. Thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. As I told you, we'd have an enormous audience, and we have. I'm going to run through a couple of questions on chat. I will say that I've had lots of comments from people saying how fascinating it was, and they weren't aware of the history, and what an amazing topic to cover. So that's fantastic. Let me run through the questions. So the first question I've had is, was there a connection between the Salomons at Broomhill and the Davidor Goldsmith family who lived nearby and commissioned Chagall's stained glass windows?
Tom, I think that's you. You know about the Davidor Goldsmiths.
I haven't found a close family connection, but I am extremely interested in the family. And as you say, those amazing Chagall windows at the church at Tudley, I think it is, or Tudley.
Yeah.
I haven't yet been to go and visit. In terms of whether there was a kind of friendship between the two families, I don't know. What I would say is that there are lots of very interesting Jewish country house connections in Kent more broadly. I mean, the Goldsmith house at Summerhill is very important. Also, the Montefiore connection, obviously, with Ramsgate. Abigail may know others as well, but
well, the Sassoons at Port Limp. I mean, there are actually a lot of houses, and there are other houses near Tunbridge Wells. I mean, we did have a list. We had others which came up. So it seemed one of the things we find in our project is that you often get enclaves of Jewish houses. So I think partly people wanted to be close to their family, and partly it was easier socially if they weren't the only Jews in a given area. And Tunbridge Wells does seem to have been a focus.
And that Kent connection, is replicated in office holding in Kent as well. So there's a sort of history of some of these Jewish families as Lord Lieutenants or as mayors of Kentish towns. And so it's replicated on the level of some of the civic governance as well.
Okay, there's a second part to that question. The lady also says she's curious to know what extent David Salomons and his donations and his Jewishness feature in the Guildhall Art Gallery displays. Although I think you did cover that slightly. This question may have come in before you got to that. And how does Trent Park, owned by the Sassoons, fit into the wider picture you're painting?
If I say something briefly about the displays, and maybe Abigail can say something about Trent Park. The short answer is I wish at the Guildhall you could learn more about the donors. I mean, it's actually been very hard to do that kind of work, and it's partly because the archives for the Guildhall are not kept on site, but are in London Metropolitan Archive. But the Guildhall received many very important donations from Jewish donors, and that story is not told in the institutional history at all. One thing I would say about David Salomons is just to say that his brother Philip is, if anything, a much more important collector. And some of you might have seen recently the sale of the Sassoon treasures in New York. The Sassoons had the most amazing collection of Judaica, which was recently sold at Sotheby's in New York. But many of the finest pieces there had been bought from Philip Salomons, who kept them in his amazing house in Hove. So he's really the kind of the origin point of the collecting of Jewish ritual objects in Britain, and was an amazing sort of scholar and collector. And so there's lots more to say about him.
Right.
Yeah, I'll talk briefly about Trent Park. Trent Park will actually feature in we're producing a book about country houses, and Trent Park will feature. So what's particularly interesting about Trent Park is it has a kind of different layers of Jewish stories. So it was a Jewish house. Obviously, it belonged to Philip Sassoon. But then it had this extraordinary history during the Second World War, which Helen Fry has written about, when it was repurposed as a kind of luxury prisoner of war camp for top-ranking Nazi generals. The entire thing was bugged, and they were kind of lulled into a sense of security. So it had a kind of country club atmosphere. They were put at their ease and encouraged to talk about aspects of the German war effort, and there was quite close collaboration, I think, between the secret listeners at Trent Park and the operation at Bletchley Park, as Helen has talked about, which also was a Jewish house, actually. So, so they were quite strongly connected, and a lot of the listeners were actually Jewish, the people who were listening to transcribing and translating the conversations, because they tended to be German Jewish refugees who had the language skills to manage this quite technical conversation. And at the very end of the war, the Nazi generals were then forced to watch the newsreel about the liberation of Bergen-Belsen in the smoking room at Trent Park, and the Jewish listeners all came up to be there as that happened. So in fact, Trent Park is a very interesting story for us because it has multiple layers of Jewish stories, so it allows us to tell different aspects of Jewish history through it, but also something about the way in which Philip Sassoon created a kind of perfect English country house, quite convenient for London, rendered it particularly suitable for this kind of secret service operation.
Okay. I've got a couple of members who actually live in the Kent area who've mentioned that they weren't aware of all the history, and how interesting it is. It's quite interesting to hear the Kindertransport connection as well. Because as you know, I'm sure, I don't know whether you know, but the AJR, the Kindertransport is part of the AJR, and actually I'm just looking through, I've actually got Kinder in the audience as well, so that's quite interesting. Is there anyone who has any connection as a Kint with these houses? Maybe you could let us know through the chat facility if the history relates to anyone. I'm not getting any responses to that. Somebody's asked, did any of these Jewish families fund the building of synagogues as well? Do we know anything related to the history of synagogues from any of these families, or was it just the houses?
Well, obviously the synagogue at Ramsgate,
yes,
was built by Sir Moses and remains there. So that would be the most obvious example. And I've come to see this as a really unique and important site because it adds the idea of what an English country house might be like. It's a really good example of a diverse English country house because the synagogue is part of it. And also it's important to understand that when he built the synagogue in the early 1830s, in fact, it wasn't clear that Jews could own land in Britain. So Isaac Lyon Goldsmith at the same time owned property through his steward. And a couple of years later, it looked as if it did become legal, and he tried to reclaim his land from the steward, and the steward refused to give it up, and they had to split it. So I think the synagogue had a kind of important role as well in the history of emancipation. It's got a big clock, so it was it's got a chiming clock. I think it's the only chiming clock on a synagogue in the UK. So it was, that was a useful thing to have in the middle of the countryside. But it was also a proud statement that it was a public thing. And when it was inaugurated, both the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi chief rabbi came to inaugurate it. So it was clearly part of the emancipation campaign. And I think we have to see these two things as quite linked. A lot of these families are also connected to endowments at different synagogues, but I'm not sure that they're actually responsible for building them. Maybe that's more about those issues.
Okay.
In fact, sorry, if I can
I
just jump in one example, because it springs to me. There is an endowment at the Central Synagogue. Lord Bearsted embellished part of the synagogue in memory of his father, Marcus Samuel. So you sometimes get gifts in memory of family members to the synagogue. The other thing I would say is it's interesting that some of these Jewish families also pay for the repair of Christian churches as well. As part of their philanthropy or their connection to the city. Some of the great city churches in London have actually been funded by Jewish philanthropy. And Moselle Sassoon, to mention a Sassoon again, was fundamental in campaigns to restore St. Paul's after the Second World War. So this is not a sort of narrow vision of charity.
Yeah, and in fact, we see that in Germany as well, because the Mossers at Schenkendorf paid to put up the church tower in the village. So there was a kind of engagement with other, the Christian life of the village as well as their own Jewish lives.
In fact, somebody's just reminded me, and I do remember now that AJR visited the Montefiore house, the synagogue, and the Chagall windows. I'm thinking probably 5 or 6 years ago now.
But trip to Kent.
We did, and it was very well taken up. Unfortunately, with the last year, one of the things that stopped has been our trips, but there's certainly quite a few places here. We've also been to Waddesdon, which is also, people have mentioned that, brilliant presentation. Lots of people asking when we're going to be doing the second part of your presentation.
We haven't quite decided, because my colleague who will be involved is on maternity leave at the moment. So
exactly, but we will make sure there's plenty of notice, and as always, it will be in our e-newsletter, on social media, and in the journal, so you won't miss it. People ask me when your book is being published.
Not for a while. When is it? Probably not till we are aiming to finish it in October 2023, but it takes a year to publish, so it'll come out, I think, in 2024. And we're hoping to connect it. So there will be a photographer called Hélène Binet is taking photographs of some of the houses, and there'll be an exhibition as well, which will go with that.
Right, and just lots of brilliant presentation. We really enjoyed it. So thank you very much. Hopefully we can put another date in and advertise it as soon as possible. We'll be in contact about that. Michael, I don't know if you want to finish with anything.
Just to add my own thanks to you, but that was really fascinating. Listing some of those places and names, it sounded like the scope for an AJR members visit around the country to all these places of interest. So,
maybe we could do a residential trip to Kent, different house every day.
But also just connecting the dots with some of the other events that we've done and other things that appear in the journal over the history of the AJR Journal Archive. And we had a great audience. I think it was about over 100 at one point.
Yeah.
So congratulations and thank you very much for doing it. And yeah, we look forward to part 2 at some point. You've whetted everyone's appetite now, you see.